The sheriff's deputy looked at the mountain of neatly stacked plastic bins covering my neighbor's front porch, rubbed the back of his neck, then looked over at me with the kind of expression that said he'd already figured out exactly what had happened before anyone spoke a single word. My neighbor kept yelling that I was harassing him, that I was trespassing, that I had lost my mind, but the deputy quietly asked one question instead. Are all these items yours? The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt much longer, and that was the moment I knew the whole thing had finally come full circle. 3 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't trying to teach anybody a lesson, and I definitely wasn't planning on becoming the guy who delivered 50 containers of garbage to someone's front door before sunrise. I was just a middle-aged farmer who liked quiet mornings, fresh tomatoes, and neighbors who understood where their property ended. My name's Ethan Walker, and I own just over 5 acres outside Temple, Texas, about an hour north of Austin. It's nothing fancy, just flat pasture that I've slowly turned into something I'm proud of since buying it back in 2018. I've got raised vegetable beds, a chicken coop my nephew helped me build one summer, a couple pecan trees that finally started producing decent crops, and enough open ground to remind me every evening why I left city life behind. I spent 20 years working commercial construction before deciding I'd rather make a little less money and sleep a whole lot better. Out here, people usually wave when they pass. If someone's fence blows down after a storm, everybody shows up with tools before anyone asks. That's just how it's always been. My previous neighbors, the Harpers, had lived next door almost 30 years before they retired to Arkansas. We traded vegetables, borrowed ladders, and watched each other's places during vacations. Never once argued about property lines because we both respected something simple. If it wasn't yours, you left it alone. Then the Harpers sold the place to a young couple from Seattle named Logan and Madison Brooks. They couldn't have been older than 30. Nice-looking house, expensive pickup, 2 electric SUVs, outdoor furniture that probably cost more than my tractor. I figured they were remote workers chasing country life after getting tired of the city, and honestly, I wished them well. Everybody deserves a fresh start somewhere. The first thing that caught my attention wasn't anything they said. It was what they didn't say. About 4 days after moving in, I noticed them standing near the back property line holding tablets and taking pictures. I was watering tomatoes about 100 yards away, so I waved like any neighbor would. They both looked right at me, then went back to talking without waving back. I shrugged it off. Maybe they didn't see me. Maybe they were busy. We all have awkward moments. About 2 weeks later, I drove home after picking up chicken feed and immediately noticed something black scattered across the far edge of my pasture. At first, I thought somebody's trash had blown over from the highway during one of those windy Texas afternoons. As I got closer, I realized every single bag had been carefully placed in a straight line nearly 20 feet inside my property. There were 12 heavy contractor bags, old shelving boards, busted lamps, broken computer monitors, and enough food waste that I could smell it before I even got out of my truck. Flies covered everything. One bag had already ripped open, and stray dogs had dragged leftovers into the grass I'd spent weeks keeping clean. I just stood there staring for a minute because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Nobody accidentally hauled 12 garbage bags that far across someone else's property. That takes effort. That takes intention. I walked over to their house, knocked on the front door, and after about 30 seconds, Logan opened it wearing expensive workout clothes and holding a coffee mug like I'd interrupted something incredibly important. I smiled anyway and said, "Hey, I think there's been some kind of mistake. Somebody left a pile of trash on my property, and judging by what's in the bags, I think it came from over here." He didn't even glance toward the backyard. He shrugged and said, "We figured that land wasn't really being used." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I laughed once and said, "Well, it is being used. It's mine." His smile disappeared. "It's just empty field." I answered, "Private property doesn't stop being private because somebody isn't standing on it 24 hours a day." He stared at me without saying anything, took one slow sip of his coffee, then replied, "I don't really see the problem." Before I could answer, he quietly closed the door in my face. I stood there looking at my own reflection in the glass for another few seconds before turning around and walking back home. I remember thinking maybe he was just embarrassed and handled it badly. Maybe he'd come apologize later. Maybe we'd laugh about it someday over a fence line conversation. Looking back now, That was probably the last innocent thought I had about my new neighbors before everything spiraled into something none of us could have imagined. The apology never came. Instead, the next morning I watched from my barn as Logan drove right past the pile, without even slowing down, and somehow that bothered me more than the trash itself because it told me this wasn't carelessness, it was entitlement. I spent most of that Saturday loading every bag into my utility trailer, wearing thick gloves because several had already started leaking. The smell was awful, rotten food mixed with old paint, moldy carpet, and whatever had been sitting inside those broken electronics. By the time I finished, I had sweat running down my back and dirt stuck to my boots. But I also had photographs of everything, timestamps on my phone, and a disposal receipt from the county landfill for $93.40. My old construction foreman used to tell me that emotions disappear, but paperwork lives forever. So when I got home, I scanned every receipt, printed an itemized invoice, and mailed it certified with a polite note asking Logan and Madison to reimburse the cleanup cost within 10 business days. There wasn't a single angry word in that letter because I still believed reasonable people eventually did the reasonable thing. 10 days passed. Nothing. 2 more weeks went by, and I almost convinced myself the issue was over until I drove back from my sister Claire's birthday dinner one Sunday afternoon. I rounded the corner toward the back pasture and slammed on my brakes so hard my coffee flew across the dashboard. Sitting nearly 25 feet inside my property was an old sectional couch, soaked from recent rain, ripped open across one armrest, surrounded by stacks of broken bathroom tile, drywall chunks, empty paint cans, splintered lumber, rusted plumbing fixtures, and what looked like the remains of an entire home renovation. Deep tire tracks carved through the grass, leaving muddy ruts almost 6 inches deep. They hadn't just dumped garbage this time. They had driven onto my land with a truck, unloaded construction debris, and left without the slightest concern that another human being owned the ground beneath their tires. I climbed out slowly, took photographs from every angle, measured distances with a tape measure I kept in my truck, and even recorded a slow video showing the property markers that had been installed years earlier when I bought the place. Anger has a funny way of changing as you get older. When I was 25, I probably would have stormed over there yelling. At 52, I understood that calm people usually win arguments because calm people collect evidence, while angry people create it for someone else. That evening, I called my attorney, Richard Holloway. Richard had prosecuted property crimes for almost 20 years before opening a private practice. We'd become friends after he helped me negotiate a commercial lease several years earlier, and he had one habit I appreciated more than anything. He never rushed to court unless the facts were already stronger than the emotions. The next morning he drove out, walked the property with me, examined the tire marks, looked at the couch, and quietly said, "Well, they just upgraded this from being annoying to being illegal." He explained that illegal dumping, trespassing, and property damage were all separate issues, especially since the truck tracks had destroyed part of the irrigation line feeding my vegetable beds. We documented everything. Then Richard drafted a formal demand letter requiring immediate removal of the debris, reimbursement for damages, and written confirmation that future trespassing would stop. 3 days later, an overnight envelope arrived, not from Logan, but from a law office in Portland. Apparently, Madison's uncle had referred them to an attorney back home. I sat in Richard's office while he read the letter aloud. According to their lawyer, the boundary between our properties was subject to uncertainty. The land appeared vacant and unused, and their clients had acted under a reasonable good faith belief regarding the practical use of adjacent open space. Richard lowered the paper, looked at me over his glasses, and started laughing. Not loud, not disrespectfully, just the kind of laugh someone gives when they've heard an argument so ridiculous it almost deserves applause. "Ethan," he said, "I've seen criminals tell better stories than this." He pulled my property file from the cabinet and spread the survey across his desk. Steel markers, recorded coordinates, county approval. Everything had been filed years before Logan ever bought the neighboring property. There wasn't a mystery to solve because there wasn't a mystery at all. Richard filed suit that same week seeking damages for trespassing, illegal dumping, cleanup expenses, restoration of the damaged pasture, attorney fees, and punitive damages based on repeated conduct. The total came to just under $13,000. Court was scheduled 3 weeks later. During those weeks, something interesting happened. Every evening I'd walk past that growing pile of junk, and instead of getting angrier, I started thinking. Their attorney had made one statement that kept replaying in my mind. They never denied the items belonged to Logan and Madison. In fact, by arguing good faith, they had indirectly acknowledged ownership. Richard noticed the smile on my face one afternoon and asked what I was thinking. I said, if that's legally their property, then maybe it should be returned to them. He stared at me for several seconds before asking the only question that mattered. You're not planning to damage anything, are you? No. Trespass? No. Threaten them? Not even close. He leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and after another long pause simply said, well, I'm curious now. The next morning I drove into town and bought 50 heavy-duty clear storage containers with locking lids. The cashier actually asked if I was opening a warehouse. I smiled and said, something like that. For nearly 2 weeks my barn turned into an evidence room. Every evening after dinner I'd put on gloves, sort another section of the dumped material, and carefully organize it. Plastic bottles in one container. Aluminum cans in another. Electrical cords bundled neatly together. Bathroom tiles stacked by size. Paint cans grouped according to whether they were full or empty. Broken shelves. Curtain rods. Light fixtures. Cabinet hardware. Even loose screws and hinges were collected into labeled zipper bags. I numbered every container with waterproof labels and photographed the contents before sealing each lid. My niece Emily stopped by one afternoon and burst out laughing when she saw rows of perfectly organized bins stretching across the barn floor. Uncle Ethan, she said, this looks less like revenge and more like the world's most organized garage sale. I laughed too because, honestly, she wasn't wrong. There was something oddly satisfying about turning their chaos into order. By the time I finished, I had a complete photographic inventory that matched every container. Nothing had been thrown away. Nothing had been broken. Every single item they had abandoned on my property was cleaner, drier, and more organized than when they'd left it. The afternoon before court, I rented a 20-foot box truck, loaded every container using a hand dolly, double-checked my inventory sheets, and went to bed surprisingly calm. My alarm rang at 4:30 the next morning. The Texas sky was still dark as I drove toward their house with 50 numbered containers secured inside the truck. I parked legally along the road just after 6, lowered the loading ramp, and began carrying each bin one at a time. I wasn't loud. I wasn't in a hurry. I simply placed them neatly across the front porch, lining both sides of the entryway before extending the rows down the walkway. The arrangement almost looked artistic. Perfectly straight lines of crystal-clear containers, every label facing forward, every lid locked shut. When the final container was in place, the front door could still open a few inches, but no one was walking through without moving their own belongings first. I stepped back, took several photographs for my records, and just as I reached the truck, the curtains inside the house flew open. Madison looked out first, froze, then disappeared. A second later, the front door shoved against the wall of containers, stopping almost immediately. Logan's voice exploded from inside the house. What the hell is this? I calmly answered. I'm returning your property. His face turned bright red. Get this junk off my porch. I shook my head. It stopped being my responsibility the day you dumped it on my land. He immediately reached for his phone. I'm calling the sheriff. I nodded once and replied, that's probably a good idea. Then I leaned against my truck and waited while the morning sun slowly climbed above the pasture, knowing the most important conversation of this entire story was only a few minutes away. About 15 minutes later, a McLennan County Sheriff's deputy pulled into the driveway, stepped out, and spent the first few seconds simply looking at the wall of perfectly organized storage bins covering the Brooks family's porch. I could almost hear him trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Logan walked over first, talking fast, pointing at me, accusing me of harassment, trespassing, intimidation, pretty much everything he could think of. The deputy listened without interrupting, then walked over to me and asked, mind telling me your side? I handed him a folder Richard had told me to keep in the truck. Inside were dated photographs of the dumping, copies of the certified letters, the landfill receipt, the demand notice, the lawsuit filing, the survey map, and the inventory showing exactly what was inside every numbered container. He stood there reading for several minutes while Logan became noticeably quieter. Finally, the deputy looked up and asked him one simple question. Sir, "Are these your belongings?" Logan hesitated. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. "Well, yes, most of them." The deputy nodded slowly. "And these items were left on Mr. Walker's property?" Another pause. "Yes, but—" The deputy held up one hand before he could finish. "Then he's returning your property. I don't see any evidence he's damaged anything." He glanced toward the containers one more time before adding something that still makes me smile whenever I think about it. "Honestly, it's probably the neatest illegal dumping case I've ever seen." Then he wished us both a good morning, climbed back into his cruiser, and drove away. Logan didn't say another word. Neither did I. There wasn't anything left to say. The next morning, Richard and I walked into the county courthouse, carrying 2 bankers' boxes full of documents. Across the aisle sat Logan, Madison, and their attorney, who suddenly looked much less confident than he had in his letters. Judge Eleanor Hayes had a reputation for being patient, but she also had very little tolerance for people who wasted the court's time. Richard presented our case methodically, almost like he was teaching a class. First came the photographs showing the original dumping. Then the disposal receipt from the first cleanup. Next came the certified mailing records proving they had been notified. After that, the second series of photographs showing the construction debris, the damaged pasture, the tire tracks, and the irrigation line. Finally, he introduced the county survey, complete with recorded coordinates and permanent monument locations. The judge studied each exhibit carefully before turning toward the defense. Their attorney repeated the same argument about uncertainty over the property line, but this time Judge Hayes opened the digital county survey on the courtroom monitor. She zoomed in until every recorded marker became visible, then compared it with the photographs we'd submitted. After a long moment, she removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Logan. "Mr. Brooks, there is no uncertainty here. The boundary has been professionally surveyed and legally recorded for years. Your vehicle crossed it repeatedly. Your household waste crossed it repeatedly. Your construction debris crossed it repeatedly. The only thing that appears confused is your understanding of private property." The courtroom became so quiet I could hear someone shuffling papers in the back row. She ruled entirely in our favor, awarding reimbursement for cleanup costs, restoration of the damaged pasture, attorney fees, and additional damages, bringing the total judgment to just over $12,000. Then she added one final condition neither side had requested. Because the dispute had been caused by repeated claims of confusion, both properties would receive permanent survey monuments and highly visible boundary markers installed by a licensed survey company at the Brooks family's expense. It was such a practical solution that even Richard smiled. About 3 weeks later, I watched a survey crew spend an entire day setting heavy steel monuments, bright orange witness posts, and permanent reference markers all along the property line. You could have found that boundary from outer space after they were finished. Over the following months, something interesting happened. The arguments disappeared. No more garbage. No more trucks crossing onto my land. No more excuses. We didn't become friends, and honestly, I never expected we would. We simply became neighbors who understood exactly where one property ended and another began, and sometimes that's enough. The grass eventually grew back over the tire ruts. I repaired the irrigation line, expanded my vegetable garden, and built a second chicken run the following spring. Every now and then I'd see Logan outside while I was mowing. We'd nod politely, nothing more. Maybe the lawsuit changed him. Maybe it didn't. People only change when they decide to, and that's something no judge can order. But I do know this: respect usually arrives one of two ways. It comes through character, or it comes through consequences. I'd always hoped for the first one. In the end, we settled for the second. Looking back, people often ask if stacking all those containers on his porch was worth the effort. My answer surprises them. It wasn't about revenge. If revenge had been my goal, I would have acted while I was angry. Instead, I waited, documented everything, stayed inside the law, and simply returned something that already belonged to its rightful owner. Sometimes the most satisfying response isn't creating a bigger problem. It's making someone take responsibility for the one they created themselves. And now I'd really like to hear what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have handled it differently? Or do you think returning every single piece of their own property was the fairest lesson possible? Let me know down in the comments, because these neighbor disputes always seem to divide people right down the middle. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes good fences make good neighbors, but clear boundaries make even better ones.